April 27th, 1865, 2:30 in the morning. The Mississippi River, 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. A boiler explodes, then a second, then a third. The steamboat Sultana tears apart from the inside, in total darkness, in near freezing water, carrying more than 2,000 men. Most of them are soldiers. Most of them just survived years inside Confederate prison camps. They were finally going home. Now they are being thrown into a river they cannot see, into a current they cannot fight, surrounded by fire, wreckage, and screaming. By sunrise, somewhere between 1,800 and 1,900 of them will be dead. More people died on the Sultana than died on the Titanic, more than died at Pearl Harbor. It remains the worst maritime disaster in American history. You have probably never heard of it, and the reason has nothing to do with how many people died. The Sultana was built to legally carry 376 people. On the night she exploded, she was carrying somewhere close to 2,400. That is more than 6 times her legal limit. This was not an accident of chaos. It was a business decision. The United States government paid steamboat companies a fee for every paroled prisoner they carried north. More prisoners meant more money. The officer responsible for assigning those prisoners to boats took a payment to make sure the Sultana got far more than her share. His name is in the official record. So is the payment. People on the dock that night said out loud that the boat looked dangerously overloaded. Some said she would never make it past the next bend in the river. Nobody stopped the boarding. Nobody turned a single man away. 3 things about the Sultana that most accounts leave out. The first, the boilers had a documented problem 3 days before the explosion. A boiler maker in Vicksburg found a dangerous bulge in one of the iron plates. He told the crew it needed to be cut out and replaced entirely. That repair would take 3 days. The captain didn't have 3 days. He ordered a patch instead, a thinner sheet of metal, riveted directly over the damaged section. It held for exactly 96 hours. The second, the officer who controlled prisoner transport assignments had been quietly profiting off the Sultana for months. Investigators later traced the pattern. Every time the Sultana docked near his post, more prisoners somehow ended up assigned to her than to any other boat on the river. Nobody ever explained why that pattern was allowed to continue. The third, the explosion happened 9 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered, 12 days after Abraham Lincoln was shot, and 1 day after John Wilkes Booth was finally cornered and killed in a Virginia barn. American newspapers had no space left for another tragedy. The men who survived came home to a country that had already spent every tear it had on 2 other stories. By the spring of 1865, the American Civil War was ending, but its prisons were still full. Andersonville in Georgia, Cahaba in Alabama, 2 of the worst prison camps the war produced. Men inside them had been starved for months. Many had dysentery, scurvy, and malaria. Some weighed less than 100 pounds. When the war finally wound down, the United States government wanted these men home fast, and the fastest route north was the Mississippi River. The federal government set a price for the job. Steamboat companies were paid a fee for every paroled prisoner they carried, a flat rate per enlisted man, a higher rate per officer. For a steamboat captain in financial trouble, a boatload of paroled prisoners was the single most profitable cargo on the river that spring. J. Cass Mason, captain of the Sultana, was in financial trouble. He had recently lost part ownership of the boat in a contract dispute and needed cash fast. When word came that thousands of paroled prisoners were waiting at Vicksburg, Mississippi for transport north, Mason wanted as many of them as he could get onto his boat. The man who controlled those assignments was Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Hatch, chief quartermaster for the region. Hatch and Mason had a history. Investigators after the disaster found a clear financial relationship between the two men, one that predated this voyage by months. When the time came to assign prisoners to boats waiting at Vicksburg, Hatch made sure Mason got the largest share, far larger than his boat could safely hold. The men waiting at Vicksburg were not ordinary soldiers returning from routine duty. Most had spent the final year of the war as prisoners at Andersonville in Georgia or Cahaba in Alabama, two of the deadliest prison camps the Confederacy operated. Andersonville alone had held more than 32,000 men in a stockade built for a fraction of that number, with disease, starvation, and exposure killing thousands before the war even ended. Survivors arriving at Vicksburg in April 1865 were often described by witnesses as walking skeletons. Men in their 20s who looked decades older, many unable to climb a gangplank without help. These were the men the Sultana was about to carry north, packed shoulder to shoulder, 6 times beyond her legal limit. The system that brought these men to Vicksburg in the first place had its own complicated history. Prisoner exchanges between North and South had broken down for long stretches of the war, leaving men in camps far longer than anyone on either side initially expected. By 1865, with the Confederacy collapsing, paroles accelerated rapidly, creating a sudden surge of thousands of former prisoners needing transport north all at once, far more than the available steamboats could comfortably handle, even without anyone trying to profit from the overcrowding. That logistical bottleneck, combined with the financial incentive built into the transport contracts, created exactly the kind of pressure that made an already dangerous decision feel, to the men making it, almost routine. On April 24th, 1865, the loading began. The Sultana's legal capacity was 376 passengers, including crew. By the time loading stopped, somewhere between 2,300 and 2,400 people were aboard. Soldiers packed every deck, the upper decks never designed to bear that kind of weight, visibly sagged under the crowd. Witnesses on the Vicksburg dock said the ship looked unmistakably dangerously low in the water. 3 days earlier, while the boat was still docked at Vicksburg for repairs, a boilermaker named R.G. Taylor discovered a serious problem with one of the Sultana's 4 boilers. A section of iron plate had developed a dangerous bulge, a clear sign of metal fatigue under pressure. Taylor told the crew the only safe fix was to cut out the damaged plate and replace it completely. That job would take a minimum of 3 days. Mason didn't have 3 days. He had thousands of prisoners waiting and a payday attached to every one of them. He ordered a faster solution, a thin patch riveted directly over the bulge without addressing the underlying metal fatigue at all. The boiler was pressurized and put back into service almost immediately. On April 24th, with her decks straining under more than 6 times her legal capacity, the Sultana left Vicksburg, heading north against one of the worst spring floods the Mississippi had seen in years. The river was running high and fast. The current fought the boat's engines every mile of the journey, forcing the boilers to work harder than they would have under normal conditions. The Sultana reached Memphis on the evening of April 26th. She took on coal, dropped off some cargo, and continued north just after midnight into the early hours of April 27th. The patch boiler had now been running under constant strain against flood current for nearly 3 full days. At 2:30 a.m., 7 miles upriver from Memphis, the patch failed completely. The resulting pressure wave detonated 2 more boilers within seconds. Decks packed with sleeping, exhausted soldiers were torn open and collapsed into each other. Hundreds of men were thrown directly into the burning wreckage. Hundreds more were thrown into the freezing river itself. What followed has been described by survivors as something closer to a slow-motion massacre than a shipwreck. The men aboard the Sultana were not ordinary passengers. They were recently released prisoners of war, emaciated, weakened, many barely able to stand, let alone swim against a flooding river in the dark. The Mississippi at flood stage was running wide, fast, and bitterly cold for late April. Survivors later described a river so thick with drowning men that some couldn't tell where to swim because every direction was filled with other people fighting for the same piece of driftwood. The fire spread quickly through the wreckage that remained afloat. Trapping men who had survived the initial blast only could be burned in the hours that followed. Others, too weak from imprisonment to hold on to anything, simply slipped under and never resurfaced. The debris field stretched for miles downriver, carried by the current toward Memphis. Rescue came from an unlikely direction. Residents along the riverbank near Memphis, woken by the sound of the explosion and the cries carrying across the water, launched whatever boats and rafts they had. Union gunboats stationed nearby joined the effort within the hour. For the men still alive in the water, the wait for rescue could be the difference between survival and death by hypothermia. And for many, that wait was simply too long. By the time the rescue effort wound down over the following days, the death toll had become almost impossible to calculate with precision. No complete passenger manifest existed for the voyage, a direct consequence of the overloading itself. Officials had stopped trying to count heads accurately once the number of boarding prisoners exceeded anything resembling a manageable list. The most widely accepted estimates place the death toll between 1,800 and 900 people. Some historians argue the true number may be higher still. A military court of inquiry convened in the weeks that followed. The investigation confirmed what witnesses on the Vicksburg dock had said from the beginning, that the Sultana had been criminally overloaded, that the loading was driven by a financial arrangement between Mason and Hatch, and that the boiler repair had been inadequate and rushed. Reuben Hatch was formally investigated. He was never criminally convicted. He resigned from the Army not long afterward and returned to civilian life without ever facing meaningful consequences for his role in the disaster. The military court of inquiry that investigated the disaster in the months afterward placed significant blame on the overcrowding and the inadequate boiler repair, but stopped short of recommending criminal prosecution for any specific individual. Reuben Hatch was investigated separately by a military commission specifically examining corruption in the Quartermaster Corps. Witnesses testified to the financial relationship between Hatch and Mason. The commission's findings were damning on paper. In practice, Hatch resigned his commission before any formal court-martial could proceed, and no civilian prosecution followed. He returned to private business in Illinois and lived the remainder of his life without ever publicly answering for his role in the worst maritime disaster in American history. Captain Mason did not survive the explosion. He went down with his ship, along with the full record of exactly how many men he had agreed to carry that night. The timing of the disaster did the rest of the damage. On April 26, the day before the Sultana exploded, federal cavalry finally cornered and killed John Wilkes Booth in a tobacco barn in rural Virginia, 12 days after he assassinated President Lincoln. The manhunt for Booth had dominated every American newspaper for nearly 2 weeks. The morning the Sultana went down, papers across the country were still running headlines about Booth's death. There was no room left on the front page for a steamboat explosion on a river most readers had never heard of, carrying soldiers whose names were not yet known. The story that should have been the deadliest maritime disaster in American history ran as a small item buried deep in the back pages in most of the newspapers that covered it at all. In the century and a half since, the Sultana has remained largely outside public memory. There is a small museum dedicated to the disaster in Marion, Arkansas, near where the wreck eventually settled into the shifting riverbed of the Mississippi, a river that has moved its course several times since 1865, burying the wreck itself somewhere beneath what is now farmland, miles from the water's current path. Recovery efforts continued for weeks after the explosion. Bodies surfaced along the riverbank, as far as 200 miles downstream. Some recovered nearly a month later, many too decomposed to identify. The Mississippi River, already running at flood stage, scattered the dead across an enormous area, making any precise final count effectively impossible. Military record keepers compiled lists from surviving paperwork, telegraphed reports from rescue boats, and testimony from survivors who had watched friends and bunkmates die beside them in the water. Even decades later, historians researching the disaster have found inconsistencies between different official tallies, with some pension and burial records suggesting names that never made it onto any official casualty list at all. In the decades that followed, a number of survivors wrote down their memories of that night, some not until they were old men themselves, finally willing to revisit details too painful to discuss earlier in life. These accounts, collected and compared by historians over the following century, painted a remarkably consistent picture. Men so weakened by imprisonment that swimming even a short distance felt impossible. The deafening confusion of the initial blast and the strange, lasting guilt many survivors carried for decades afterward. Having lived through Andersonville or Cahaba, only to watch friends who had survived the same camps die feet away from freedom, on a river they could already see the lights of Memphis from. The Sultana's wreck itself was eventually located more than a century later in 1982, buried under a soybean field outside Marion, Arkansas. A result of the Mississippi River shifting its course multiple times since 1865, leaving the wreck site nowhere near open water anymore. A small museum dedicated to the disaster has operated in Marion for years, expanding its exhibits as more documentation has come to light, though it remains a modest operation compared to the scale of the tragedy it commemorates. No memorial stands in any major American city. No annual ceremony marks the date. The men who survived Andersonville and Cahaba, who endured years of starvation in the worst prison camps the war produced, who finally boarded a boat home only to die in a river 7 miles from freedom. Those men got a paragraph in 1865. Most of them have gotten little more since. If you want to understand the disasters that history simply didn't have room for, the warnings that were ignored, the decisions made for profit, and the stories that vanished into the news cycle of something bigger, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.